In this next section, we're going to talk about what can community builders learn from religion. Harvard Divinity School researchers Angie Thurston and Casper ter Kuile share their research on what structures and systems build flourishing communities of belonging and formation. From CrossFit to 800-year-old monasteries come together and explore the frontier of religion in America. Angie is an On Being fellow. Anyone listen to On Being podcast? So dope, right? It's my favorite podcast. If you don't listen to it, you should. She's a Ministry Innovation Fellow at Harvard Divinity School, supporting leaders who are deepening community nationwide. With Casper, she co-authored How We Gather and Something More, 2 reports profiling forms of meaningful community in America. I've read both of them. Really, really great, really to the point. Highly recommend you check them out. Casper is building a world of joyful being. He's a Ministry Innovation Fellow at Harvard Divinity School as well, where he supports innovation community leaders across the secular/sacred landscape. Casper also hosts a podcast, Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, which engages a modern classic through traditional sacred reading practices. Please give me a big CMX welcome for Angie and Casper.
Hello, everyone. Hi.
Hello, everyone.
Yeah, there we go. So we're so glad to be with you all this morning. I'm really glad there were some On Being listeners in the room.
Absolutely.
Let's see those hands again. Yes, welcome. It's a wonderful podcast. What we want to do this morning is to share with you a little bit about our research and our learning, and to perhaps try and reframe how you think about the work that you do. You might wonder, why are 2 people from like a divinity school at CMX? It's a good question. We ask ourselves often, why did we end up at a divinity school at all? I grew up in England with no religious background. For those of you who are familiar with the UK, like 6% of people go to church on a Sunday in England. So it's a very, very secular culture. And I'd worked in the kind of climate change activist world and was passionate about engaging young people, mobilizing them around climate change action. But I kept realizing after a while that there was a sort of disconnect with what I'd seen that worked in history and what I was doing as an activist. Often it was about mobilizing individuals, whether it was through kind of mass emails or phone calls or all sorts of activities that was working with people one-on-one. But when I looked at history, it was about people working together, mobilizing and transforming their communities. But the people I was working with just didn't really have a community that they belonged to. So I came to the US to kind of study public policy, but just kept meeting these people at the Div school who asked much better questions. And so I kind of like slowly moved over the campus, and one day arrived at this event where everyone was sitting in the dark holding a candle and chanting, and I was like, great, this is the place for me. But it was wonderful, and I met Angie, and we both came into Div school with this question of what does community look like for people like us who don't fit into a traditional religious or spiritual identity or affiliation.
Yeah, and I, like Casper, had never heard of Divinity School. I grew up with a family that's half Jewish and half Christian, but I was raised outside of any organized religion in Boulder, Colorado. And I found my deepest, yes, Boulder. I found my deepest experiences of community through the arts. So I studied playwriting in college, and I moved to Brooklyn and spent 6 years living there, working with friends and colleagues on co-creating things, whether they were plays and musicals or festivals. And in that time, those 6 years I lived in New York, I became increasingly hungry for greater depth and a longer through line. I was having some of what we heard about in terms of peak experiences, but then I wanted to know what happened in between and how we could make meaning of it. And that was when I started to ask, like, where might people be going? And so I joined Meetup and put in all the spiritual things that you can add to your profile and started to look, like, if all of my friends seem to be outside, like me, of organized religion, where might we be gathering? Where might they be going? And that inquiry ended up upending my life because I started to find, they seem to be going to the most unlikely places, and yet they're finding things there that feel a lot like religion.
So to give you just a brief orientation to the context that we're in, We're in this rapid time of change in terms of religious identity. You might have read about the rise of the nuns being non-affiliated people, and especially in the millennial generation, this is the fastest growing group. Millennials are now more than a third, non-affiliated people, more than a third of the millennial cohort. And as you can see, even younger millennials are even less affiliated. So there's this kind of massive shift in how people identify their inner life, their personal practices, the kind of bigger story that they're in, as Michael was talking about this morning. And what that looks like is there's this huge institutional crisis in the religious world. So, the number of churches that close down each year, this is a conservative estimate, 70% of non-Orthodox Jews marry outside of the faith. The kind of barriers of where the community begins and ends is really being challenged. And the institutions of seminaries, the kind of training grounds of community leaders, of soulful community leaders, are shrinking because fewer and fewer people are stepping up to say, I want to be a priest, or I want to be an ordained Methodist. Or, of course, there's some exceptions to this. Buddhism and Islam are growing in the US, mostly through immigration, but the traditional kind of bastions of Judeo-Christian, kind of American religious life are definitely being challenged. And that's within a broader context of trust and institutional failure, whether it's government or the media, etc. But there's this real disrupt between people's own experiences and the language and the identity they have, and the institutions and their priorities.
So that's on the institutional level, but then let's think about it on the cultural level of the individual, of personal experience in the midst of this transition. So what we've found is that there is an enormous amount of what we've come to call spiritual homelessness, right? That there is a portion of this unaffiliated generation that is they would name themselves as atheist or agnostic. But then there's 2 and 3 that claim they believe in God or some kind of higher power, and yet they have nowhere to go with that. 1 in 5 of them are praying every day, and yet that's an individualized experience, right? So there's this population that doesn't have a space to go. And then there's just the bigger picture of the crisis of isolation in this country, right? We have 1 in 4 Americans saying they have no one to talk to about what matters to them, and that includes their family members. And 1 in 5 saying they have only one, right? So there's this large-scale epidemic. And this is not only something to be thought about through the lens of religion, but rather through the lens of even something like public health. We're now having statistics come out that say loneliness may reduce life expectancy more than obesity or smoking. That according to massive meta-analysis that's been done, it's a greater health risk than obesity or even smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So here's the public health industry becoming aware of this crisis and the impact it's having on people's lives, and yet not necessarily having a way forward in order to address it.
So all of that's just the context. We want to talk about a different thing, which is, like, what are we seeing in response to this? And when we went out and asked friends, colleagues, peers, so like, where do you find your community? The first answer often was CrossFit. Who's
Yes!
a CrossFitter in the room? Couple folks. Where's your box?
Somerville, Massachusetts, 5-year code.
Nice. All right, Somerville. I'm a member at Commonwealth, so there you go. Yes. You wouldn't know it, to be honest. You wouldn't know it. Well, my husband wants us to go like early in the morning, but I'm more of an afternoon person. Okay. Whew. Yeah. Oh man. Even from afar,
Getting called
he's still
out
in my
even
brain.
in California.
We're always watching.
That's right.
And that's a
Case
theme.
in point.
That's an important theme. Okay, so seriously, the accountability of the CrossFit culture is one of the reasons why that community is so strong. And the accountability that's built up is something you might have seen in a congregation maybe 200 years ago. Hey, you didn't show up to church on Sunday. What about that, right? Nobody's coming up to you in the office on Monday morning with that question. But for sure, they're going to give you a call like, hey, you didn't come to our usual Thursday workout at 6:30 and you're always here. Oh, you went on vacation? Well, let me know next time so I don't have to make this call. And it's not the trainer who's calling people, it's the community members themselves, right? People have made a commitment to show up in a certain way in this place because the way you show up in the gym is the way you show up in life. And if you make commitments and cheer each other on and hold each other to a higher standard while you're working out, that's the way you're going to show up as a parent, as a sister, as a colleague. This is not just a physical formation space. This is a place of ethical formation, right? This is a project that's much bigger than your biceps. This is about like who you are as a human being in the world. Yes, okay. So, but no one thinks like, oh, I'm going to go work out. Like, oh, this is actually a religious experience, and these are the primary community of belonging that I'm in, right? Like, that's the kind of connection that we want you to make. And because it's so important to people, like, if you go to Harvard, if you're vegan, or if you go to CrossFit, how do you know? People are going to tell you, right? Like, they want to either tell you that they're amazing, or they want to bring you in. And so that evangelical culture is something that's really embedded into the CrossFit culture. Because, so this is where it gets really crazy. Yeah. If you want to be an ordained minister, let's say, or you want to be an ordained rabbi, 5 years of rabbinical school, a year of studying in Israel often, minister, you're probably going to go through divinity school for 3 years, take all sorts of exams, do like psych tests. There's like a lot of steps to go through. You want to open a CrossFit box? You go to a 2-day seminar and you write an essay. And in that essay, they're not looking for your experience as a trainer, as a business leader. They're looking for one thing. Has your life been changed by CrossFit, and do you want to change other people's lives with CrossFit? It's that kind of evangelical zeal which builds the amazing community that organization has become. And there's all sorts of like ritualized behaviors. You have the workout of the day, which is one workout that happens across these 15,000 affiliate boxes around the world. There's like millions of people doing this every day. And it's the same physical movement, right? It might be a deadlift. It might be whatever it is. But it's kind of analogous to everyone saying the Lord's Prayer in whichever congregation you're in. Or it might be, all right, we're coming up to the High Holy Days, right? So there's this sense of being part of something bigger across space and time, right, even though you're in your own like micro community. And those rituals are named after people, right? So we just had, I always get confused in America.
There's one called the Angie.
There's one called the Angie.
It's like one of the most terrifying. Yeah.
But some of them are named after soldiers or servicewomen and men who are honored through these ritualized movements. So again, you see this kind of like ritual design showing up in a secular space that when we look at it, we think, this looks kind of religious. And the way that the founders talk about this work, it's not, yes, it's a business, but they're not trying to build a skyscraper, as Greg Glassman says. He wants to shepherd a flock. He wants to tend an orchard. So there's this, again, like this really religious language. And that shows up in how people are together. They drive each other to the hospital. They, they meet each other and fall in love. Yeah, like this is, people want to move closer to this place because they're there 4 or 5 times a week, and it becomes really the central place of meaning making in their lives. So when we started to look at this field, CrossFit kept popping up, but it's not the only one.
And CrossFit is part of a broader landscape of these fitness communities, whether it's Soul Cycle or the November Project or Tough Mudder or Spartan Race, right, where you're finding these kinds of ingredients showing up in people's lives. And so that's happening across sectors. So you could look at the world of maker spaces. An amazing organization in Somerville called Artisans Asylum is a place that was created basically for people to come together around their passions of self-expression. So you have welding and robot making and woodworking and jewelry making and all kinds of people finding a place where they can actually dig into that thing they really want to do and not be alone in it. And so there's this amazing amount of creative formation. You think about something like a guild, where you have craftspeople from all different genres who are all in the same space, and an incredible amount of support that people receive for their efforts. And so one example was a woman who wanted to make a Halloween costume for her child, and it had some kind of light up features, and she'd never done anything like it. So she reached out to the community, both in person, where they have a physical space, and then they also have an online forum that's extremely active and very supportive, and basically put out there her hopes for this. And this remarkable amount of immediate feedback from around the community of people donating their insight, donating their actual materials. And then there's this incredible mutual celebration that occurs, right, when she creates the thing and they all get to see it. This is actually a very serious place of sanctuary for a lot of these folks. It's open 24 hours a day, and the leader of it, Derek, talks about how it's a home for unicorns who don't have one, right? This is a place where people can come be weird and be themselves, and there is a a kind of intense reality to that sometimes. You'll have people coming at 3 a.m. and welding instead of self-harming. You'll have people who are, have insecure housing and are often using this as a place they can come. Artisans Asylum has ended up being an advocate for housing security in the greater Boston area as a result. And then you have a lot of coming together around holidays. They have a maker's giving where people not only make food and bring potluck dishes, but also make wacky 3D printed centerpieces that glow, right? So you have this kind of coming together around people's creative gifts and celebration over a shared meal. And then the mutual improvement that, again, much like CrossFit, goes well beyond the creative self-expression. People are not only becoming better artists, better makers, but also better people as a result of their affinity and relationships with each other. And so you see this at a place like Artisans Asylum. You also see it, say, in the gaming community or in theater and the arts, right? All these different organizations that go through that artistic lens for their work.
So what we've started to see is that people who lead these communities, whether they expected to or not, are really taking on a pastoral role in the lives of their communities. And that means dealing with the sort of life questions that come up in so many of our lives. It might be death, it might be divorce, it might be the celebration of a marriage or a new baby. It might be disappointing news with one's career.
Right.
And these leaders are being asked to accompany and kind of shepherd people through that process, often without really any of the training that one would usually receive in a religious context. Another community that's been really intentional about that is the dinner party. Is anyone familiar with the dinner party? A number of you, wonderful. This is an amazing community of hosts who kind of welcome friends and strangers into their homes for a meal who have all experienced significant loss in their life in one way or another. Set up by some friends who both lost a parent early in their lives. And this kind of small group model will not be unfamiliar for those of you who do have a religious background perhaps, but there's this sense of, by sharing your story and witnessing and hearing other people's stories and finding the similarity, that there's an experience of healing and wholeness, right? People bring this kind of heavy load, it's shared, and by sharing the burden, it's made lighter. Of course, there's also the, ironic connection that you gather around a table, drink wine, and eat bread in remembrance of someone, right? It has little Eucharistic overtones. But what's really important in this is that, when Lennon and her team founded this organization, they thought it was about grief. They thought it was about the experience of losing someone. But what they've learned is more and more people have come to them saying, well, my mother hasn't died, but we haven't spoken in 20 years, and I really feel like, I've experienced loss, or my pet who I'd loved for 15 years just died. Like, does that count? Or, I'm a survivor of sexual trauma. Like, I feel like I've lost a piece of myself because of that. Can I come? And so what they've started to understand is that all of these experiences are isolating in some way. And what they're offering is a place of connection, of safety, of intimacy. And so as we look at this kind of broader landscape, we see organizations, and you can kind of, we've playfully taken organizations with similar logos and color palettes. Like, that's when there's a thing happening.
There's a thing.
But all of them are countering this crisis of isolation in one way or another, whether it's through fitness or through conversation, through creative arts. There's this bigger thing that's going on. And we started to hear language and see themes that kept coming up time and time again.
Right, and this is on the lips of the leaders, the participants, people saying again and again, so much so that we felt like we had to actually write it down and share it back to them. And they were these themes. It was these joint ideas of personal and social transformation, right? People growing in some way into the person they have the potential to be, and then also being activated to put that transformation in service of others. Then you have this accountability Casper talked about, right? Whether that's in CrossFit or many of these other communities, about not only showing up, but also following through on the bigger commitments that you've made. This idea of activating and expressing creativity. And often that comes in a way of people setting aside time, right? These things like adult summer camps and morning dance parties, where there's this permission that's given to activate what's kind of living inside you and doesn't necessarily get to be shared in a more professional context, say, or in a lot of our everyday lives. Then this purpose finding, it's fascinating. One of the metrics we've come to learn is when people participate in these communities, sometimes they end up changing jobs because they find something of themselves by participation, and then they end up wanting to move their life to be in service of that higher purpose. And then this undergirding community element, right? And we've become kind of protective of the word community, that this is not just a network in the sense of people who are loosely connected based on some affinity or some other thing that they have shared, but rather that this is people who know each other and care about each other with such a depth that they understand what the other people are going through in their lives at any given moment and are actually invested in that in some way, right? That there's a mutual care that's occurring in these relationships. And often that takes place over time because it takes time for those relationships to form. So as Casper, go ahead.
I just want to add one thing, which might be, as you're thinking about the work that you do in the communities that you lead, most of which are online, how are you offering these kind of 6 themes in the work that you do? Because as people are in this time of great loneliness and isolation, and it's important to mention that those health impacts are not just about structural isolation,
right.
It's about the feeling or the experience of being isolated, even if you're surrounded by people or relationship. That has the same impact on mortality. So what we want to offer to you is that even if you don't think it, you might be offering a community of meaning and connection, which might be the primary place of belonging for the people that you work with. And that is not just something which is a business opportunity or a lot of fun. Like, that's a really big responsibility. And this is the work that we've been doing with these leaders of whether it's fitness or arts communities, is to try and hold a mirror and say, you're doing this really big and important thing, and that can be really, really hard. And there are kind of millennia of traditions that have been doing that work before, and there are many, many resources within those traditions that might serve you. So wherever you find yourself in your community leadership, one of the invitations we want to offer to you is, how are you being supported in your leadership with peers, like we are here, which is wonderful, right. Who are the kind of mentors, or perhaps even like a spiritual mentor of some such, who can be with you and accompany you when you're working with someone online. I mean, Lola's story, I think it was Lola yesterday.
Yeah, on the panel yesterday, yeah.
Right, like when you're suddenly trying to like mobilize people to comfort someone who's thinking of committing suicide, right? Like, these are life's biggest, most meaningful, most frightening experiences sometimes. And you can only lead as deep as you can go deep yourself.
Right.
And so a lot of our work has been supporting leaders in their own kind of leadership formation. So we've been bringing leaders together, kind of like CMX. And actually, from Thursday to Sunday this last week, we did a second, or I guess third by now, gathering of these community leaders. And this is a real mix. Some of these folks lead religiously identified organizations like dinner churches, or folks who do
online sanghas, or pop-up Shabbat, if anyone's heard of that, right? Yeah.
And then there's also CrossFit trainers and people who lead, gosh, what else do we
This
have?
amazing couple runs a CrossFit box and a Presbyterian church.
Yes.
So.
And they know which ministry is more impactful. But it's what we've experienced, and we were worried that bringing that kind of secular and religious
right.
group together would be really uncomfortable. Within 4 or 5 hours, you couldn't tell who was who, because their experience of the work that they were doing felt so analogous. Yes, there was sometimes different language to describe it, different rituals, different traditions, but there was something in which they were doing which was beyond language, that they were all kind of pointing to. And it's been a great joy for us to accompany these leaders and to try and offer new ways of looking at the traditions that we have access to serve this current moment. Because the questions are not new, but we just need to do it in a relevant way.
And it's worth pointing out that one of the things that we encountered consistently in getting to know these leaders was, one, this feeling of sometimes being called to lead outside their depth, right? That people were bringing their whole lives to their communities. But also this ironic feeling of isolation because
right.
they're being set apart, right? When you're in the position of being responsible for feeling both administrative oversight of a group of people, but also this kind of care of their souls, to put it in the language we learned in Divinity School. There's a feeling that you can't necessarily participate in your community the way everyone else can. You have a different level of responsibility, and that means that often it can be so valuable and nourishing to be among peers. So that's both part of the reason that we've been gathering people, and something that we would offer as a real encouragement to you in this kind of space, is to just really take advantage of that kinship that you may find with folks here who are sharing in your experience.
You find yourself learning skills like being the first one to share and like open vulnerability, but like not too much, so you're not like making them deal with your shit, but like you're inviting them to share, right? Like that kind of thing. As they say in Divinity School, preach from your scars, not from your wounds, right? Like don't bring the undealt with stuff into the room,
Right,
but like
right.
illustrate. So it's those kind of things that you end up realizing that that's your role. But as Angie said, that means you're then set apart from often the very community you founded because you needed it yourself. So that's an experience we've seen over and over and again. So one of the great joys, and I never thought I would spend my 30th birthday with a group of nuns, but one of the great joys, we've hosted a series of nuns and nuns, so Catholic sisters together with non-affiliated millennial nuns and nuns. This was from the San Francisco group, but we've been hosting these around the country, and frankly, I thought we would go and have a nice chat with some nice old ladies, and like that would be it.
Well, and to be clear, their orders are dying,
Right.
largely, right? So we talked about the decline of a lot of institutional religious life, right? And often that is, we've gotten to know a lot of institutional religious leaders, and often that is something that they're encountering with great pain, understandably. So we came into these conversations recognizing that these sisters are actually, you know, they're the way of life many of them have experienced for decades and decades is shrinking.
So in conversation with them, what we realized was that actually there was an enormous amount of overlap in what we wanted to do in the world. One of the millennials said in the conversation, I think what it really comes down to is I want to kind of transform myself in the context of community to change the world. Like, that's what I'm about. And one of these elderly women said, yes, that's what we call religious life. You know, the vow to step into living with people for decades to serve the world. And I think what the invitation we have for you is to just kind of put on these glasses of imagining that your work is perhaps sacred or in some way maybe even religious work, and just think, what do I see now when I look at it like this? What are the opportunities that I have? Maybe I can bring in more ritual, more song. How can I think about using the calendar that we have, maybe the seasons or other touch points in our cultural context? What are the practices that I can have for myself that will sustain my leadership? Who can I turn to for support in my own experience? But also, what responsibilities do I now have if I am, as one of the early popes, Gregory the Great, said, ministry is the care of souls, as Angie said. If we each here are in places of responsibility where we are indeed caring for the souls of others, what boundaries do I need to maintain? What new resources do I need to seek that I can give to people who look to me for leadership? So that might be a terrifying charge, but I think it is a realistic one. Because as people are losing the traditional bounds of relationship and meaning making, they're searching for new things and they're coming to you. So with that, we give you great thanks for being with us, and good luck in your work. Thank you.